In October of 1973, a war kicked off that lasted less than 3 weeks. On the surface, it was a regional fight over some desert and rocky highlands, but the shockwaves from that short, brutal war would end up toppling governments, sparking a global recession, and believe it or not, planting the seeds for the collapse of a superpower. So let's dig in and break down how this 3-week conflict literally reshaped our world.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to set the stage and look at the tensions before the war. Then, we'll get right into the surprise attack itself and zoom in on the absolutely critical battle for the Golan Heights. From there, we'll pull back to see the huge global shockwave the conflict triggered. And finally, we'll wrap up by exploring the shaky, unstable peace it all led to. To really get why this war was so explosive, we first have to understand the environment. The early 1970s were a real pressure cooker, just waiting to blow. So you have to picture the Middle East back then as this giant chessboard for the Cold War. You had the United States backing Israel, and on the other side, the Soviet Union was arming and advising its Arab neighbors, especially Egypt and Syria. This meant every little move in the region had the potential to spark a massive superpower confrontation. This setup created a really dangerous psychological mix. On the Israeli side, there was this sense of military invincibility, this feeling that they just couldn't be beaten. But on the Arab side, there was this burning, intense desire to restore their national honor and, of course, to reclaim the land they'd lost back in '67, like the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. And look, this wasn't just a matter of pride. Not by a long shot. The Soviets had poured enormous amounts of advanced weapons into the region. We're talking new tanks, sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, powerful missiles. They'd also professionalized the officer corps and drilled the armies in Soviet military doctrine. The Arab forces of 1973 were a whole different animal from the armies Israel had so easily beaten just 6 years before. So you've got this Israeli overconfidence on one side and these newly capable, rearmed Arab armies on the other. It was the perfect storm for one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern history. And then it happened. On October 6th, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. The entire country was basically at a standstill for fasting and prayer. That's when Egyptian forces poured across the Suez Canal, while Syrian armies stormed into the Golan Heights. And in a devastating early move, Syrian commandos took the key listening post on Mount Hermon, effectively blinding Israeli intelligence right from the start. And if you want a perfect snapshot of just how deep this miscalculation ran, look no further than this quote. Just 8 days before the invasion, the head of Israel's military intelligence made this exact prediction. The belief that the Arabs couldn't and wouldn't attack was so deeply ingrained that it was treated as a fact. Okay, so now I want to zoom in on the fight that almost broke Israel, the desperate, completely lopsided battle for the Golan Heights. I'm not exaggerating when I say the entire war hung in the balance right here. The numbers here are just staggering. The Syrians rolled in with about 1,500 tanks. And to defend the entire Golan front, the Israelis had just 177. That is a nearly 10-to-1 disadvantage. It's almost unbelievable. But, it wasn't just a numbers game. This was a classic showdown of quality versus quantity. Israeli tank crews were some of the best in the world, absolute masters of long-range gunnery. But the Syrians had a secret weapon. Their Soviet-made tanks came equipped with advanced infrared night vision, which gave them a huge, huge advantage after the sun went down. The Syrian battle plan, straight out of the Soviet playbook, was incredibly meticulous. It was designed as a multi-wave assault, built to use their sheer numbers to just punch through the Israeli defenses, grab the key roads, and then sweep right across the Golan and down to the Jordan River. And for the first 2 days, their plan was working perfectly. The Syrians broke through in the south and were literally on the verge of pouring into northern Israel. But then, 2 things happened. First, tiny groups of Israeli tanks fought with unbelievable courage, holding off entire Syrian brigades and buying precious, precious hours. And second, right at the most critical moment, the Syrian advance just stopped. To this day, nobody is exactly sure why. But that pause gave just enough time for exhausted Israeli reserve units to rush to the front and somehow stabilize the line. So, with the tide just starting to turn on the battlefield, the shockwave of this conflict began to radiate outwards, and it pulled the entire world into its wake, changing the global economy forever. And man, this escalation happened incredibly fast. With Israel on the brink of collapse, the U.S. launched a massive airlift of military supplies called Operation Nickelgrass. In direct response, the Arab oil-producing nations, led by Saudi Arabia, unleashed a brand new weapon, the oil embargo. Then, as Israeli forces turned the tide, the Soviets threatened to jump in directly, which led President Nixon to put U.S. nuclear forces on DEFCON 3 alert, the highest it had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The economic hit was just immediate and catastrophic. The embargo made oil prices quintuple. They went up 5 times. For the very first time, oil was being used as a geopolitical weapon, and it sent the world's industrialized economies into a tailspin. We're talking long gas lines, massive inflation, and skyrocketing unemployment.
But here's where the story takes this fascinating, unexpected turn. While the West was struggling with this new stagflation, the Soviet bloc was quietly walking straight into a debt trap. See, with the high oil prices, Western banks were suddenly flooded with cash, these petrodollars, and they started offering cheap loans. To keep their planned economies growing, the Eastern European countries borrowed a lot. I mean, just look at Poland. Their debt exploded from about $1 billion to over $20 billion in less than a decade. And this is where you see this huge split. 2 completely different reactions to the same crisis. The oil shock forced the West to adapt. It kickstarted a huge push toward energy efficiency, R&D, and the information technology revolution. It was what economists call intensive growth. But the rigid, centrally planned economies of the Soviet bloc, they couldn't pivot. They just doubled down on their old energy-guzzling heavy industries, a path of extensive growth. They were falling behind, and all that debt was making it so much worse. So what was the war's final legacy? Well, it absolutely shattered old myths and created a completely new political reality, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world. Now, on paper, Israel won the war. They pushed back both armies and even advanced deep into their territory. But the cost was just immense. The country was deeply traumatized by the heavy casualties and the sheer shock of a near disaster. The myth of invincibility, gone. The national inquiry that followed, the Agranat Commission, caused a political earthquake, forcing national heroes like Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan to resign. But here's the crazy thing. The sheer shock of the war actually cracked open a door for peace. Because the Egyptian army had performed so well in the opening days, their president, Anwar Sadat, could claim a political victory. He could now negotiate from a position of strength. And the Israelis, shaken out of their complacency, were suddenly much more willing to talk. This led directly to Sadat's incredible historic visit to Jerusalem, and eventually to the Camp David Accords, the very first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation. And this is the kicker, the real reason this matters so much on the world stage. That economic tsunami started by the oil crisis and the debt trap it created ended up fatally weakening the Soviet bloc's economies. They just couldn't keep up with the West's technological leap forward. Now, the 1973 war didn't cause the fall of the Soviet Union, but it absolutely put it on the fast track. So how can a 3-week war reshape the world for 3 decades? It's an incredible question, right? The October War is this stark reminder that the consequences of a conflict are almost never contained to the battlefield. This brief, regional war shattered military myths, redrew the map for peace in the Middle East, turned the global economy into a weapon, and helped bring a superpower to its knees. It just goes to show you that sometimes the biggest shockwaves are the ones you never, ever see coming.